Mason always said trust was the strongest part of a marriage. The day I came home 2 days early, I realized trust could also be the easiest thing to weaponize. Sitting in my car beneath our apartment building, I watched the bedroom light switch off without warning. Minutes later, a woman stepped out of the elevator, and the moment I saw her face, it felt as if someone had reached into my past and dragged an old nightmare back into my life. 15 years earlier, she had destroyed one of the most important friendships I had ever known. Now she was walking out of my home, followed by my husband. For more than 20 years, I believed I had the kind of marriage people secretly wished for. Mason and I met in our 20s while working at different companies in Indianapolis. He had a calm confidence that made everyone around him feel comfortable, and he treated people with a kindness that seemed effortless. He remembered birthdays, called my parents just to check on them, and never forgot the little things that made me smile. Friends often joked that I had won the husband lottery, and for a very long time, I honestly believed they were right. Together we raised two incredible children, built successful careers, and eventually moved into a beautiful condominium overlooking the river. Life was not perfect, but it felt dependable, and I thought that was enough. Everything changed after our children left home. Our daughter, Olivia, moved to Boston for graduate school, while our son, Ethan, started his first job several hours away. The silence inside our home was overwhelming. Every room reminded me of memories that had slowly faded into the past, and I decided to take a part-time position at the local library just to give myself a fresh routine. Mason encouraged the idea, telling me I had spent years taking care of everyone else and deserved something that belonged entirely to me. Looking back, those words sound almost cruel because they distracted me from noticing how dramatically his own life had started to change. About 8 months before everything collapsed, Mason became busier than I had ever seen him. His consulting business supposedly landed several important corporate contracts that required constant travel, late dinners, and endless client meetings. His phone practically became another part of his body. It never sat unattended on the kitchen counter anymore, and every call seemed important enough to take in another room. Whenever I casually asked who had called, he always smiled and gave the same answer: it was just work. After more than 2 decades together, questioning him felt unnecessary. Trust had become a habit instead of a decision, and habits are surprisingly difficult to break. Earlier that week, one traveled to Louisville for a 3-day training seminar hosted by the library system. The conference ended unexpectedly on Tuesday afternoon after several speakers canceled, leaving everyone free to head home early. I considered calling Mason, but instead decided to surprise him. It sounded romantic in the simplest way. I stopped at his favorite butcher shop, bought 2 expensive steaks, picked up a bottle of red wine we both loved, and even grabbed a fresh cheesecake from a bakery downtown. During the drive home, I laughed to myself thinking how happy he would be to see me standing in the kitchen preparing dinner 2 days ahead of schedule. When I parked beneath our building around 4:30 that afternoon, everything still felt perfectly normal. As I unloaded my overnight bag, I happened to glance toward our 12th floor bedroom window. The light was on even though the afternoon sun still filled the sky. Before I could make sense of it, the light suddenly switched off. It was so sudden that my stomach tightened without any logical explanation. I stood there for several seconds, telling myself Mason had probably come home early to change clothes before another meeting. Instead of heading upstairs, I quietly placed my luggage back into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. Something deep inside me insisted that I wait. Nearly 15 minutes passed before the elevator doors opened into the lobby. People came and went while I sat frozen behind the steering wheel, convincing myself I was imagining things. Then a woman stepped outside wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap. She paused just long enough to glance around before walking toward the parking garage exit. The second she removed her sunglasses, every memory I had spent years burying came rushing back. It was Claire Bennett, my former best friend who had disappeared from my life after betraying me in a way I never thought I could forgive. I had not seen her in 15 years, yet I recognized her instantly. Only seconds later, Mason walked out of the same elevator looking completely relaxed. He checked his watch, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and casually unlocked his SUV as though he had just finished another ordinary workday. He never looked in my direction because he had no reason to think I was there. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that they began to ache. Every instinct told me to jump out, confront both of them, and demand answers. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. Anger can cloud judgment, but silence often reveals far more than shouting ever could. After Mason drove away, I slowly made my way upstairs. The moment I unlocked the front door, I noticed an unfamiliar floral perfume lingering in the air beneath the scent of his cologne. The kitchen looked spotless, but two freshly washed wine glasses rested beside the sink, something Mason would never have used alone in the middle of the afternoon. Our bedroom looked strangely perfect, with the comforter pulled tightly across the mattress as though someone had hurried to erase every sign of being there. Then I noticed a bath towel folded neatly inside the laundry basket. When I touched it, it was still warm. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed before I collapsed. Nothing about the scene made sense. Mason was careful with everything he did. If he were having an affair, why would he bring another woman into our own home where anyone could discover them? That question bothered me more than the possibility of betrayal itself. As I searched his office, another detail caught my attention. A drawer filled with financial records had one empty space where a folder should have been. A small label remained behind identifying it as Home Equity Records, yet the folder itself had vanished. Mason had never misplaced important paperwork in his life. I quietly closed the drawer and realized my marriage was hiding something far more dangerous than I had imagined. The next morning, I waited until Mason left for work before touching anything. Instead of confronting him, I photographed every document I could find inside our safe and called my cousin, Natalie, who had worked for years as a legal assistant. She listened without interrupting before giving me the name of an attorney she trusted completely. That afternoon I sat across from Daniel Harper, calmly explaining everything from the mysterious afternoon to the missing financial folder. He listened carefully before telling me something that made my stomach tighten. Affairs usually leave emotional clues. Financial deception leaves paperwork. He advised me to collect evidence quietly, avoid signing anything, and prepare for the possibility that whatever Mason was hiding had nothing to do with romance alone. Daniel introduced me to a private investigator named Victor Hayes, a quiet former detective who preferred facts over theories. Within days, he began following Mason, and the photographs he delivered only deepened the mystery. Mason and Claire were rarely behaving like secret lovers. Instead, they spent hours entering banks, law offices and government buildings while carrying thick document folders. One photograph showed Mason handing Claire a large envelope labeled with my name. Another captured them studying paperwork inside a coffee shop with the intense focus of business partners. Somehow that frightened me more than an affair ever could because it suggested planning instead of passion. Following Danielle's advice, I requested copies of my credit reports from every reporting agency. Hidden among accounts I recognized was a home equity loan worth nearly $250,000. I stared at the page in disbelief because I had never approved such a loan. Daniel quickly obtained copies of the paperwork, and the moment I saw the signature page, I knew someone had forged my name. It looked convincing at first glance, but every small detail was wrong. Even worse, the notary seal belonged to Claire. Suddenly the pieces fit together. She had not returned to steal my husband. She had returned to help him steal my future. Victor's investigation uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Mason had quietly transferred money into a new investment company that listed only two owners, himself and Claire. He had refinanced property, moved retirement savings, and slowly shifted valuable assets away from anything connected to our marriage. Every discovery painted the same picture. He was building an entirely separate financial life while making sure the debts remained tied to me. When Daniel explained what could have happened if the plan had continued, I felt physically sick. I might have been left responsible for enormous loans while the wealth disappeared somewhere beyond my reach. Instead of revealing what I knew, I played the role of the trusting wife. I cooked dinner, listened to Mason describe imaginary client meetings, and smiled through conversations that suddenly felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, Daniel helped freeze my credit, notify banks about possible identity fraud, and protect every account that still belonged solely to me. A few days later I noticed the first crack in Mason's confidence. He came home unusually anxious, disappeared into his office, and spent nearly half an hour arguing on the phone with someone whose name he never mentioned. For the first time in 22 years, the man who always controlled every situation looked genuinely frightened. Soon afterward, Mason suggested selling our condominium. He claimed the real estate market was perfect and insisted we should simplify our finances before retirement. He scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor and expected me to sign the paperwork immediately. Daniel had already warned me this moment would come. I attended the meeting, carefully read every page, then calmly closed the folder without touching the pen. I explained that my attorney would review everything first. The color drained from Mason's face almost instantly. He laughed awkwardly and insisted lawyers were unnecessary, but I politely refused. During the drive home, neither of us spoke. I could almost hear his carefully designed plan falling apart. Only days later, Victor delivered photographs showing Mason and Claire arguing outside an office building. They no longer looked like confident partners. They pointed at documents, raised their hands in frustration, and finally walked away in opposite directions. Around the same time, one of the banks officially questioned the forged loan documents after noticing irregularities in the signatures. Because my credit had already been frozen, additional transfers were immediately suspended. For the first time since that afternoon in the parking garage, I felt hope replacing fear. Mason was no longer controlling the situation. Other people were finally asking the same questions I had been asking myself. Everything collapsed faster than I expected. Claire hired a criminal defense attorney and soon agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for possible leniency. She admitted notarizing documents she had never actually witnessed being signed, insisting Mason convinced her I had already approved everything. Whether she believed him or simply ignored obvious warning signs no longer mattered. The evidence clearly showed Mason had organized the entire scheme while Claire helped make it appear legitimate. Together they had spent months trying to shift assets beyond my reach before convincing me to sign away the last pieces that remained. When Daniel invited Mason to his office, every document was already waiting on the conference table. Loan agreements, bank records, forged signatures, financial transfers, photographs and timelines covered nearly every inch of the polished wood surface. Mason stared at the growing stack in complete silence before quietly asking only one question. "When did you know?" I looked directly into his eyes and answered with complete honesty. I knew the moment I watched Claire walk out of our building. He lowered his head because there was nothing left to deny. Every carefully planned lie had finally reached its end. 9 months later, our divorce became official. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches or emotional confrontations. Only signatures, moving boxes, and the quiet understanding that the man I married no longer existed. Investigators continued examining the fraudulent loans. The investment company unraveled under financial scrutiny, and the plan Mason spent months creating collapsed piece by piece. Claire lost her professional reputation, while Mason faced consequences far beyond losing his marriage. I eventually moved into a smaller condominium overlooking a peaceful neighborhood park where every decision belonged only to me. Looking back, I no longer see that afternoon as the day my life fell apart. I see it as the day I stopped ignoring my instincts and started protecting myself. Sometimes the greatest betrayal uncovers the greatest freedom, and sometimes the strongest ending begins with the courage to quietly watch instead of immediately reacting.